The Old Alton Bridge, known locally as Goatman's Bridge, loomed like a shadowy skeleton across Hickory Creek. Its rusted frame had become the centerpiece of terrifying legends, a place where the veil between the living and the dead seemed especially thin. At night, the locals said, you could hear whispers, disembodied footsteps, and even the distant bleating of a goat. Some even claimed to have seen the Goatman himself, a half-human, half-beast creature roaming the woods. But this was no tourist attraction. In recent years, people had started disappearing. A team of paranormal investigators had vanished 2 weeks ago while exploring the bridge for an online ghost hunting series. Their equipment was found scattered beneath the bridge, torn to pieces. That's when the government stepped in, sending in a secret paranormal investigation team, a specialized unit called Spectre, to uncover the truth. Agent Reese, the team leader, stepped out of their van, staring at the dilapidated bridge with a mixture of awe and unease. Behind him, his team geared up, each member armed with ghost hunting tech far beyond what most people could imagine. They were not here to entertain the masses. They were here to face whatever dark forces haunted Goatman's Bridge. "This place is worse than I thought," muttered Julia, the team's expert on cryptids, adjusting her thermal camera. Her eyes darted around the thick woods, as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. "Keep your eyes open," Reese replied, his voice steady but tense. He had faced down shadow men, skinwalkers, and demons before, but something about this case felt different, more sinister. He couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. As they approached the bridge, the air grew heavier. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, the rustle of leaves, vanished. There was only silence. "Does anyone else feel that?" whispered Tyler, the team's tech expert. His usually cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that seemed to pulse through the air. Reese raised his hand, signaling the group to stop. He could feel it, too, a cold, oppressive presence creeping through the trees like an invisible fog. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from beneath the bridge. The team froze. "What the hell was that?" Julia whispered, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the air, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else, something unnatural. Reese motioned for the team to follow, his hand gripping his flashlight tightly as they descended toward the creek under the bridge. The growling grew louder, more menacing, as if whatever was down there was waiting for them. They reached the base of the bridge, and the source of the sound became clear, a deep black pit at the water's edge. The pit pulsed with a strange, oily blackness, a void that seemed to consume the light around it. Tyler stepped closer, his curiosity overcoming his fear. "What the hell is this?" Before anyone could stop him, a shadowy hand shot out of the pit, grabbing Tyler's ankle. He screamed as the thing pulled him into the darkness. The rest of the team rushed forward, but it was too late. Tyler was gone, swallowed by the pit. The growling turned into maniacal laughter, echoing through the trees as the ground shook violently. "We need to get out of here," Julia stammered, backing away from the pit. But Reese stood his ground. "No, we're not leaving until we get him back." With their tech malfunctioning and one of their own missing, the team faced their first test, and it was only the beginning. The following morning, the surviving members of Spectre gathered at their makeshift base, a small cabin deep in the woods. It had been a sleepless night, filled with unshakable dread. Tyler's disappearance weighed heavily on everyone, especially Reese, who stared blankly at the map of Goatman's Bridge spread across the table. "Whatever that thing was, it's intelligent," Julia said, pacing the room. "It knew we were coming." Reese nodded, his jaw clenched. "This isn't just some haunting. There's something far darker here. Demonic." Before they could discuss further, the radios crackled to life, garbled voices, overlapping static. It was Tyler's voice. "Help me. I'm still here." The transmission cut out, replaced by eerie static. Everyone exchanged nervous glances. Reese grabbed his gear. "We're going back." "Are you insane?" shouted Dylan, the team's newest recruit. "That thing nearly killed us all last night. And you want to go back?" "We don't have a choice," Reese replied coldly. "If Tyler's still alive, we owe it to him to get him out." The team begrudgingly followed Reese back into the woods. The bridge loomed ahead, its iron frame casting long shadows in the fading daylight. The air was thick with tension. As they approached the pit where Tyler had been taken, a thick fog began to rise, swirling around their feet. Reese could feel the temperature drop, and with it, an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, figures emerged from the fog, silent, faceless shadows that moved with unnatural speed. They surrounded the team, blocking any escape. Julia raised her thermal camera, but it was useless. The shadows were everywhere, closing in on them. Reese drew his weapon, but even as he aimed, he knew bullets would do nothing against these beings. Out of the mist, a tall, gaunt figure stepped forward. A skinwalker, its body contorted and animalistic, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It spoke, but the words were distorted, guttural. Leave or die. Reese's hand shook as the creature's words chilled him to the bone. But he knew they couldn't leave. Not without Tyler. Not until we get him back, Reese growled, his voice filled with defiance. The skinwalker's grin widened, revealing sharp, rotten teeth. Then you will join him. The fog thickened, the shadows lunged, and the fight for their lives began. The fog swirled around them, choking out the last remnants of sunlight. The figures in the mist, dark and formless, moved like predators, encircling the team. Their eyes, glowing faintly like embers, watched with cold, inhuman intelligence. Reese gripped his flashlight, his knuckles white as the skinwalker closed in. He could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, like a pressure on his chest. The air around them felt electric, humming with energy as if the very woods were alive and angry. "We need to move," Julia shouted, yanking Reese's arm. But the fog was too thick, the shadows too close. Every direction looked the same, lost in the swirling grayness. Dylan, trembling, tried to pull out a flare, but before he could strike it, a clawed hand lashed out from the fog, raking across his arm. He screamed, dropping the flare into the underbrush. Blood dripped down his forearm, staining the ground. "They're toying with us," Reese muttered, his eyes darting around. These creatures didn't need to rush. They were savoring the fear. Suddenly, there was movement in the fog. A shape, large and grotesque, lumbered toward them. It wasn't one of the shadows. It was something far worse. A crawler. Its long, emaciated limbs dragged through the mud as it emerged from the mist, its face twisted into a grotesque mask of hunger. Its eyes, black as night, fixed on Reese. The thing let out a guttural screech, so loud it felt like the ground itself was vibrating. "Back up. Now." Reese barked, but it was too late. The crawler lunged, its claws raking the ground as it moved faster than seemed possible. Reese aimed his flashlight at it, the beam catching the creature's distorted face. For a brief second, it recoiled, shrieking as the light hit it, but it didn't slow down. Julia swung her ghost-hunting gear, a modified electromagnetic pulse device, at the crawler, activating it with a loud hum. The creature let out a spine-chilling howl, its form flickering like a dying flame. But as soon as the crawler fell back, the shadows surged forward, pressing the attack. The mist moved with them, thickening into a wall that closed in from all sides. Dylan screamed again as one of the shadow men wrapped its cold, translucent fingers around his neck. His body convulsed, as if the very life was being drained out of him. "Hold on," Reese yelled, slashing at the fog with a pocket knife. But every strike passed through the shadows harmlessly. They were untouchable. As Dylan fell limp, the shadow man dropped him and began to merge back into the fog. Reese grabbed Dylan's wrist, dragging him through the thick, suffocating mist, desperate to escape. The woods grew darker, the fog swallowing them whole. Reese could barely see Julia now, her flashlight bobbing up and down like a distant star in a sea of darkness. "We need to get out of the open," Julia yelled. "Find cover." Reese spotted a dilapidated cabin through the trees, a structure barely visible in the gloom. Without thinking, he motioned for Julia to follow him. Dylan's limp body dragged behind them, leaving a streak of blood in the dirt. They burst through the rotting door of the cabin, slamming it shut behind them. The oppressive fog pressed against the windows, rattling the walls as if it were alive. The shadows swirled outside, watching, waiting. But inside the cabin, there was a different kind of danger. Reese's flashlight flickered as it illuminated the walls. They were covered in strange symbols, demonic carvings etched deep into the wood, like warnings from another time. "What the hell is this place?" Julia muttered, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Rhys didn't answer. His eyes were drawn to something at the far end of the cabin, a small, dark shape crumpled in the corner. It was Tyler's backpack. "Tyler was here," Rhys whispered, stepping closer. But as he approached, the air grew colder, and the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse as though alive. A low, guttural growl filled the room, not from outside, but from within the cabin itself. "We're not alone," Julia said, her voice trembling. And then the floorboards beneath them began to creak. The growling grew louder, vibrating the very floor beneath their feet. Rhys froze, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Julia stepped back, her wide eyes darting to the cabin walls. The demonic carvings seemed to throb, as if something ancient and evil had been awakened. The cabin was not a sanctuary, it was a trap. Rhys slowly turned toward the source of the sound. From the darkness at the far end of the room, a figure crawled out, its form twisted and hunched like a broken marionette. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over long, brittle bones. Its eyes, black and empty, locked onto Rhys with a hunger that sent shivers down his spine. It wasn't human. Not anymore. "Tyler." Julia's voice was barely a whisper. She clutched the EMP device tightly, but her hands were shaking too much to activate it. Rhys stepped forward, shining his light on the creature. The thing let out a low hiss, recoiling from the beam, but it didn't back down. It crawled forward, dragging itself across the floor, its long, spindly fingers leaving deep gouges in the wood. "Stay back," Rhys shouted, though his voice betrayed his fear. The creature tilted its head, like it was studying them, and then it spoke, its voice raspy and broken, as if it hadn't used words in years. "Help me." The voice was unmistakable. It was Tyler. "Oh my God!" Julia gasped, stepping back in horror. But this was no longer Tyler. Whatever had possessed him, whatever had become him, was far from human. His body was a grotesque parody of itself, twisted by some dark force that had claimed him. Rhys's mind raced. The thing wearing Tyler's skin was a puppet, its strings pulled by something far more dangerous. This was the heart of Goatman's Bridge. This was what had taken their friend. Suddenly, the windows of the cabin shattered, and the fog poured in like a living entity, swirling around the room. The shadows were back, but this time they weren't just watching. They were coming for them. "We need to go," Julia screamed, fumbling with her gear. But Tyler, or whatever was left of him, lunged at Rhys, his clawed hands outstretched. Rhys barely dodged in time, swinging his flashlight like a weapon. The beam hit Tyler's face, and for a moment, the thing recoiled, screeching in agony. But it wasn't enough. The shadows closed in, pressing against the walls, suffocating the light. "Run!" Rhys yelled, grabbing Julia's arm. They bolted for the door, but the fog thickened, slowing their movements as if they were running through water. The shadows surged forward, their cold, inhuman fingers brushing against Rhys's skin. He could feel the darkness tugging at his soul, pulling him into the void. And then, as if responding to his unspoken plea, the EMP device in Julia's hand finally activated. A wave of electromagnetic energy pulsed through the room, throwing the shadows back and sending Tyler's twisted form collapsing to the ground. The fog recoiled, hissing like a wounded beast, but it wasn't defeated. "Not yet. We can't stay here," Rhys gasped, dragging Julia out of the cabin. Behind them, the fog swirled angrily, the shadows retreating into the night, but they knew it was only a matter of time before the darkness returned. As they stumbled through the woods, Rhys couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, something far worse than the creatures they had already faced. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of hooves echoed through the trees. The Goatman was coming. The night grew unnaturally still as Rhys and Julia stumbled through the dense woods. The thick fog clung to them like a second skin, every shadow moving just outside the reach of their flashlights. The distant echo of hooves grew louder, the rhythm unsettlingly steady, as though something ancient and relentless was tracking them. "We can't outrun it," Julia panted, her breath fogging up in the cold air. Her eyes darted from side to side, searching for any sign of movement. We have to hide. Reese nodded, trying to ignore the growing dread gnawing at his insides. There was no time to rest, no time to think. But the hooves, they were getting closer. They crashed through the underbrush, hearts pounding, until they came across an old, crumbling cemetery. The gravestones were worn and crooked, many overtaken by moss and vines. In the middle of the graveyard stood a mausoleum, its stone door slightly ajar. Over there, Reese pointed, grabbing Julia's arm. They ran toward the mausoleum, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. Inside, the air was stale and thick with decay. Old, broken coffins lined the walls, their wood splintered and rotting. The smell of death was overwhelming, but it was their only refuge. Reese pushed the heavy stone door closed as much as he could, leaving only a small crack to see outside. "Do you think it'll find us in here?" Julia whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. "I don't know," Reese muttered, gripping his flashlight tighter. His heart hammered in his chest, the sound of his own pulse deafening in his ears. Suddenly, the air inside the mausoleum grew colder, unnaturally cold. A chill spread through the room, as though something ancient and malevolent had entered. Julia gasped, her breath visible in the freezing air. A low growl echoed through the chamber. The flickering light from Reese's flashlight caught movement. A shadow impossibly large, standing just outside the mausoleum. The hooves had stopped. Goatman. Reese peered through the crack in the stone door. The creature was huge, its towering form obscured by mist and shadow. Its eyes glowed red, piercing the darkness like burning embers. Large, twisted horns spiraled from its head, casting long, jagged shadows across the cemetery. The goatman's head tilted, sniffing the air like a predator stalking its prey. Then, in a voice that was both human and beast, it spoke, the words slithering through the mist like venom. "I see you." Reese's blood turned to ice. The words hung in the air, sinking into the walls of the mausoleum like a curse. The creature didn't need to find them. It already knew they were there. Julia's hand tightened around her EMF reader, its green lights flickering erratically as the electromagnetic energy in the air surged. The goatman let out a deep, rumbling laugh, the sound reverberating through the stone walls. Suddenly, the ground began to shake. The gravestones outside shifted, some toppling over as if disturbed by an unseen force. The fog thickened, swirling faster and faster until it was like a living entity, pressing against the door with terrifying force. "We have to go," Reese whispered, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. But before they could move, a hand, cold and skeletal, reached through the stone wall and grabbed Julia's wrist. She screamed, pulling away, but the grip was iron tight. The skin on her wrist began to turn black, spreading like poison through her veins. "Reese!" she cried, her voice filled with terror. Reese swung his flashlight wildly, smashing it into the skeletal hand. It shattered into dust, and Julia collapsed to the ground, clutching her arm in pain. But it wasn't over. The door burst open with a loud crash, and the goatman stepped inside, filling the mausoleum with its towering presence. Its red eyes glowed brighter, and the air grew thick with the stench of death. Reese and Julia backed away, trapped in the small stone chamber. There was nowhere to run. The goatman raised its clawed hand, pointing directly at them. The shadows on the walls began to writhe, twisting into grotesque humanoid shapes. They moved like wraiths, creeping closer and closer, their hollow eyes fixed on Reese and Julia. "Your souls are mine," the goatman hissed. And then the shadows attacked. The shadows tore through the mausoleum like a hurricane, their cold, inhuman fingers clawing at Reese and Julia as they scrambled to the farthest corner. The stone walls seemed to close in on them, suffocating in their ancient silence. The goatman stood in the center of the chaos, watching with those glowing red eyes, a twisted smile on its monstrous face. Julia swung the EMF reader at one of the shadow wraiths, but it passed through the figure as if it were smoke. It let out a chilling scream, its hollow mouth opening impossibly wide as it lunged for her again. This time, Reese grabbed a jagged piece of stone from the broken wall and thrust it at the wraith. It flickered, distorted, but continued its relentless approach. "They can't be killed," Reese shouted, panic rising in his voice. The shadows multiplied, crawling from every corner of the mausoleum, seeping through cracks in the walls and floor. Reese's flashlight flickered again, the beam barely cutting through the thick, oppressive fog that now filled the small chamber. Julia's face was pale, her wrist still blackened from the skeletal grip earlier. She winced in pain, her body growing weaker as the poison spread. "We need to get out of here," she muttered, barely able to stand. The goatman's laughter echoed, deep and resonant, vibrating the walls around them. It lifted its head, sniffing the air once more, savoring the fear in the room like a predator playing with its prey. The shadows swirled around its hooves, feeding on the dread. Suddenly, Reese's eyes caught something. A small brass trapdoor at the base of the mausoleum wall. It was nearly invisible, covered in dirt and grime. Hope flickered in his chest for the first time. "There!" Reese shouted, pointing to the trapdoor. It might be a way out. He grabbed Julia's arm and dragged her toward the trapdoor. The shadows clawed at them, tearing at their clothes, leaving long, jagged marks on their skin. Blood seeped from the wounds, but Reese didn't stop. He kicked at the rusted latch until it gave way with a loud creak. The trapdoor swung open, revealing a dark tunnel below. Without hesitation, Reese shoved Julia in first, then followed, slamming the trapdoor shut behind them. The darkness swallowed them whole, but at least they were away from the Goatman, for now. The tunnel was narrow, damp, and smelled of decay. It sloped downward, leading deeper into the earth. Reese held Julia close as they crawled through the suffocating darkness, every scrape of their movements echoing unnaturally through the tight space. What's down here?" Julia whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know," Reese replied, trying to keep his voice steady. But deep down, he knew that whatever was waiting for them below was just as dangerous as what they'd left behind. As they crawled deeper, a faint light appeared ahead, flickering like a distant flame. Reese felt his heart race, but they had no other choice. They had to keep moving forward. But then they heard it, the sound of hooves echoing through the tunnel, growing louder by the second. The Goatman wasn't done with them yet. The tunnel twisted and turned in impossible ways, its walls slick with moisture and some unknown black substance that clung to Reese and Julia's skin as they crawled deeper into the earth. The hooves still echoed behind them, but now they were distant, like a nightmare fading, but not gone. Their breath was ragged, their bodies trembling from both exhaustion and fear. The faint light ahead grew brighter, flickering like a dying flame, casting eerie shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls, mocking their escape. Finally, the tunnel opened into a large, circular chamber. The walls were covered in strange, ancient symbols etched into the stone, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. At the center of the room stood an altar, a massive stone slab covered in dried blood, with iron shackles bolted into the sides. Above it, hanging from chains, was the skeletal remains of what looked like a goat's head. Its empty eye sockets seemed to watch them. This is wrong," Julia whispered, clutching her arm where the blackness continued to spread. She winced, the pain intensifying with each passing moment. Reese moved toward the altar, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of another way out. The air was thick with the smell of death and decay, and something else, something darker. It was like the room itself was alive, breathing, waiting for them to make a mistake. "We can't stay here," he muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. "That thing, it's still out there." But before they could move, the ground beneath the altar began to tremble. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, pulsating like a heartbeat. A low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber, followed by the sound of something massive shifting in the darkness beyond. Reese took a step back, his heart racing. "What the hell is this place?" Julia didn't respond. She was staring at the altar, her eyes wide with terror. The blood on the stone slab was fresh now, glistening under the sickly light, and from the shadows something began to emerge. A figure, hunched and twisted, with skin like leather and eyes that gleamed with malice. It was not the Goatman. This was something older, something worse. The creature's limbs were unnaturally long, its fingers ending in sharp, jagged claws that scraped against the stone floor. Its face was a mask of hatred, with hollow eyes that seemed to burn with the fires of hell itself. A mouth full of sharp, rotting teeth parted in a gruesome smile. The air grew colder as the creature stepped forward, its gaze fixed on Reese and Julia. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, its voice like the scraping of metal against bone. "Now you belong to the labyrinth." Without warning, the walls of the chamber began to shift. The stone slabs twisted and turned, creating new passageways, closing off old ones. The room was alive, changing, trapping them deeper within the underground maze. The altar's chains rattled, and from the shadows, more figures emerged, twisted, misshapen creatures that slithered and crawled toward them. Julia screamed, grabbing Reese's arm as the creatures closed in. The room was closing in on them. There was no escape. "We have to move," Reese shouted, pulling her toward one of the new openings in the wall. Now, they sprinted through the shifting corridors, the sound of scraping claws and guttural growls chasing them. The maze twisted around them, its passages narrowing, walls closing in, until they were forced to crawl through tight spaces. The air was heavy with the stench of rot, and the glow of the symbols seemed to guide them deeper into the heart of the labyrinth, not out of it. At every turn, the creatures were there, lurking in the shadows, their hollow eyes gleaming with hunger. Reese could feel them watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. But they kept moving, their only hope to stay ahead of the nightmare closing in around them. But the maze was endless. There was no escape, and then they hit a dead end. The walls around them closed in, and Reese and Julia found themselves trapped in a small, circular room, identical to the one they had just left. At the center, another altar. But this time, something or someone was chained to it. It was a man, his body mangled and broken, his skin pale as death. He looked up at them, his eyes wide with terror. "Help me," he whispered, his voice weak, barely a breath. "Please." But before they could move, the creatures descended. The room filled with the sound of the creatures' claws scraping against stone as they closed in on the altar. Reese's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The labyrinth had sealed them in, trapping them in this grotesque, nightmarish chamber. Julia staggered backward, her breathing shallow. Her arm was now completely black, the infection spreading faster than either of them had realized. She looked at Reese, eyes wide with panic. "I can't, Reese, I can't feel my arm." "We'll get out of this," Reese lied, his voice trembling. But even he didn't believe it. The walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, the creatures surrounding them, eyes glowing with a hunger that could never be sated. The man on the altar coughed, blood dripping from his mouth. His chains rattled as he tried to lift himself, but his body was too broken, too frail. You have to stop it. Stop the ritual before it's too late." Reese turned to him, desperation filling his voice. "What ritual? How do we stop it?" The man gasped for breath, his eyes flickering with fear and pain. "The Goatman, it's not just one entity. It's part of something older, darker. It's part of the labyrinth. If you don't stop it, you'll never leave." Reese's mind raced. The symbols on the walls, the shifting corridors, the creatures. It all made sense now. They were trapped in a ritual, a living, breathing ritual designed to consume them, to feed the Goatman, to feed the labyrinth. Julia screamed as one of the creatures lunged at her, its claws tearing through her flesh. Reese grabbed a broken piece of stone and swung it wildly, striking the creature in the face. It howled, recoiling, but another one took its place, gnashing its teeth and lunging forward. The altar began to glow with a sickly green light, the symbols on the walls pulsating faster and faster. The man on the altar let out a final, agonized scream as his body convulsed, his blood boiling as it was drained into the stone. Reese grabbed Julia, pulling her toward the altar. "We have to stop it. Whatever this is, we have to destroy it." But the creatures were closing in. The labyrinth walls seemed to breathe, closing in on them, suffocating them. Reese and Julia stood paralyzed, the sickly green glow from the altar casting grotesque shadows across the twisted chamber. The creatures encircled them now, their hollow eyes gleaming with malice, claws tapping on the stone floor with a rhythmic, unsettling beat. Each monstrous figure was waiting for the ritual to complete, their hunger palpable in the stagnant air. I don't know what to do," Reese whispered, his hands trembling as he gripped the jagged stone tighter. The green light intensified, pulsating like a heartbeat, while the labyrinth walls closed in on them like the jaws of a beast. Julia collapsed against the altar, her body racked with pain as the infection consumed her arm. The blackened skin began to pulse in time with the symbols on the wall, as if it were part of the ritual, too. She let out a low, guttural groan, her eyes glazing over as the darkness inside her grew. "Reese," she gasped, her voice weak. I think it's too late for me." No, we'll find a way," Reese said, but his words were hollow. He knew the truth. Whatever curse was binding this place, it was beyond their comprehension. Julia's arm had turned into something unnatural, her skin crawling like it was alive. As the creatures grew closer, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and a voice, deep, gravelly, and otherworldly, boomed through the chamber. A sacrifice must be made. The voice echoed through the labyrinth, sending shivers down Reese's spine. The creatures paused, heads tilting in unison as they listened to the command. It wasn't the voice of the Goatman. It was something much older, much darker. The voice came again, its tone insistent. "One must die for the other to live. Choose, or the labyrinth will consume you both." Reese's breath caught in his throat. The creatures stood still, waiting for the decision. The symbols on the walls glowed even brighter, casting the room in an eerie green hue. He could feel the weight of the decision crushing him. "No," Julia shouted, her voice filled with desperation. "You're not sacrificing yourself for me, Reese. We're in this together." Reese looked into Julia's eyes, her face pale and gaunt, the infection rapidly spreading. Tears welled in his eyes, but he fought them back. "We don't have a choice," he whispered. "It's the only way to stop this." Julia shook her head, but she was too weak to argue. Her body convulsed, the infection now coursing through her veins. The symbols on her skin glowed brighter, binding her to the ritual. Reese stood frozen, unsure of what to do, when the creatures started to move again. Slowly, they closed in, their claws clacking louder as they moved with purpose. Time was running out. Suddenly, a thought struck him. If the altar was part of the ritual, maybe it could be destroyed. "Julia, hold on," Reese shouted, rushing toward the glowing altar. He lifted the jagged stone and brought it down with all his strength on the surface. The slab cracked, the green light flickering erratically. The creatures roared in unison, their shrieks deafening as the walls of the labyrinth trembled violently. The altar shattered into pieces, and the glow vanished. For a brief moment, the room was plunged into complete darkness, and the creatures seemed to dissipate into nothingness. But the silence didn't last. The ground beneath them erupted with a loud, bone-shaking crack, and from the depths of the labyrinth rose something even more terrifying, the Goatman itself. Its massive, horned figure loomed over them, its eyes burning with hatred. Reese's heart pounded in his chest as the Goatman's presence filled the room. He grabbed Julia and pulled her to her feet, her body weak and barely responsive. The creature let out a blood-curdling roar, and the labyrinth began to collapse around them. "We need to run," Reese shouted, dragging Julia toward the nearest passageway. The Goatman's hooves pounded behind them, its breath hot and rancid as it closed in. They sprinted through the shifting corridors, barely dodging the collapsing stone walls. The maze twisted and changed, but Reese felt a faint hope that maybe, just maybe, they could escape. But then Julia collapsed again. "Reese, I can't go on," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The infection had taken over, her skin now a sickening shade of black. "Leave me, save yourself." "No," Reese shouted, pulling her to her feet once more. "We're getting out of here together." The Goatman's roar echoed through the maze as it drew closer. Reese's heart pounded in his chest, every step forward a struggle against the crumbling walls and the deafening roar of the Goatman behind them. Julia's weight dragged him down, her body nearly limp as the infection consumed her entirely. She was slipping away, and with every passing second, Reese's hope of escaping this nightmare faded. The tunnel ahead twisted in impossible directions, the walls seeming to stretch and close in at once. The labyrinth was alive, reshaping itself to trap them deeper. And in the distance, the Goatman's hooves thundered, shaking the earth beneath their feet. But then, ahead of them, a faint light. Reese's eyes widened, adrenaline kicking in as he dragged Julia toward the glow. "Come on!" he shouted, though his voice was ragged, his strength nearly gone. The air was thick with the stench of decay and sulfur, but that faint light was their only hope. As they reached the light, the tunnel opened into another chamber, but this one was different. The symbols on the walls were still there, glowing faintly, but the room was empty. At its center stood a single figure, cloaked in shadow, with eyes like embers burning through the darkness. The figure spoke, its voice calm, almost gentle. "You seek escape, but this is not your world to leave. Not without a cost." Reese stumbled forward, his chest heaving. Who are you?" he demanded, though he already knew. This was no ordinary spirit. This was the one who controlled the labyrinth. The Goatman answered to him. "I am the keeper of this place, the architect of the labyrinth," the figure said, stepping forward. "And I can offer you a choice. Leave her behind, and you may go free. But if you stay, you will both be consumed." Reese looked at Julia, her body barely alive, her skin turning to ash. He couldn't leave her, but if he stayed, they would both die. I can't leave her," Reese whispered, his voice breaking. The figure smiled, though it was a cruel, mocking grin. "Then you are both lost." Suddenly, the walls trembled again, the Goatman's roar echoing through the chamber as it stormed toward them. Reese's grip tightened on Julia's hand. He had made his choice, but before the figure could act, Julia's eyes fluttered open, glowing with a faint, unnatural light. She spoke, her voice low and strained. "No, I won't let you take him." The ground beneath them cracked open, and the chamber exploded in light. The last thing Reese heard was the Goatman's scream of fury as the labyrinth collapsed around them.